Hi guys, we are in the middle of trying to understand Rishi Aurobindo's philosophies from his book The Life Divine, and today we start the 15th chapter. It's called The Supreme Truth Consciousness. And as usual, it starts with a quote from an Upanishad. It's from the Mandukya Upanishad. The quote is, "One seated in the sleep of superconscience, amassed intelligence, blissful and the enjoyer of bliss, this is the omnipotent. This is the omniscient. This is the inner control. This is the source of all." Now Rishi Aurobindo writes, we have to regard therefore this all-containing, all-originating, all-consummating supermind as the nature of the divine being, not indeed in its absolute self-existence, but in its action as the Lord and Creator of its own worlds. This is the truth of that which we call God. Obviously, this is not the too personal and limited deity, the magnified and supernatural man of the ordinary Occidental conception. Because that conception erects a too human ideolon of a certain relation between the creative supermind and the ego. We must not indeed exclude the personal aspect of the deity, because the impersonal is only one face of existence. The divine is all existence. But it is also the one existent. It is the sole conscious being, but still a being. Nevertheless, with this aspect we are not concerned at present. It is the impersonal psychological truth of the divine consciousness that we are seeking to fathom. It is this that we have to fix in a large and clarified conception. The truth consciousness is everywhere present in the universe as an ordering self-knowledge by which the One manifests the harmonies of its infinite potential multiplicity. Without this ordering self-knowledge, the manifestation would be merely a shifting chaos, precisely because the potentiality is infinite, which by itself might lead only to a play of uncontrolled, unbounded chance. If there were only infinite potentiality without any law of guiding truth and harmonious self-vision, without any predetermining idea in the very seed of things cast out for evolution, the world could be nothing but a teeming, amorphous, confused uncertainty. But the knowledge that creates, because what it creates or releases are forms and powers of itself and not things other than itself, that knowledge possesses in its own being the vision of the truth and law that governs each potentiality, and along with that, an intrinsic awareness of its relation to other potentialities and the harmonies that are possible between them. It holds all this prefigured in the general determining harmony which the whole rhythmic idea of a universe must contain in its very birth and self-conception, and which must therefore inevitably work out by the interplay of its constituents. It is the source and keeper of law in the world, because that law is nothing arbitrary. It is the expression of a self-nature which is determined by the compelling truth of the real idea that each thing is in its inception. Therefore, from the beginning, the whole development is predetermined in its self-knowledge and at every moment in its self-working. It is what it must be at each moment by its own original inherent truth. It moves to what it must be at the next, still by its own original inherent truth. It will be at the end that which was contained and intended in its seed. What a beautiful line. In the end, it will be that which was contained and intended in its seed. This development and progress of the world according to an original truth of its own being implies a succession of time, a relation in space, and a regulated interaction of related things in space, to which the succession of time gives the aspect of causality. Time and space, according to the metaphysician, have only a conceptual and not a real existence. But since all things, and not these only, are forms assumed by the conscious being in its own consciousness, the distinction is of no great importance. Time and space are that one conscious being viewing itself in extension, subjectively as time, objectively as space. What a beautiful line. subjectively as time, objectively as space. Our mental view of these two categories is determined by the idea of measure, which is inherent in the action of the analytical, and dividing movement of mind. Time is for the mind a mobile extension measured out by the succession of the past, present and future in which the mind places itself at a certain standpoint whence it looks before and after. Space is a stable extension measured out by divisibility of substance. At a certain point in that divisible extension, mind places itself and regards the disposition of substance around it. In actual fact, mind measures time by event and space by matter. But it is possible in pure mentality to disregard the movement of event and the disposition of substance and realize the pure movement of conscious force which constitutes space and time. These two are then merely two aspects of the universal force of consciousness, which in their intertwined interaction comprehend the warp and woof of its action upon itself. And to a consciousness higher than mind, which should regard our past, present and future in one view, containing and not contained in them, not situated at a particular moment of time for its point of prospection, time might well offer itself as an eternal present. And to the same consciousness not situated at any particular point of space, but containing all points and regions in itself, space also might well offer itself as a subjective and indivisible extension, no less subjective than time. At certain moments we become aware of such an indivisible regard, upholding by its immutable self-conscious unity, the variations of the universe. But we must not now ask how the contents of time and space would present themselves there in their transcendent truth, because this our mind cannot conceive, and it is even ready to deny to this indivisible any possibility of knowing the world in any other way than that of our mind and senses. What we have to realize and can to a certain extent conceive is the one view and all-comprehending regard by which the supermind embraces and unifies the successions of time and the divisions of space. And first, if there were not this factor of the successions of time, there would be no change or progression. A perfect harmony would be perpetually manifest, coeval with other harmonies in a sort of eternal moment, not successive to them in the movement from past to future. We have instead the constant succession of a developing harmony in which one strain rises out of another that preceded it and conceals in itself that which it has replaced. Or if the self-manifestation were to exist without the factor of divisible space, there would be no mutable relation of forms or intershock of forces. All would exist and not be worked out. A spaceless self-consciousness, purely subjective, would contain all things in an infinite subjective grasp as in the mind of a cosmic poet or dreamer, but would not distribute itself through all in an indefinite objective self-extension. Or again, if time alone were real, its successions would be a pure development in which one strain would rise out of another in a subjective free spontaneity, as in a series of musical sounds or a succession of poetical images. We have instead a harmony worked out by time in terms of forms and forces that stand related to one another in an all-containing spatial extension. An incessant succession of powers and figures of things and happenings is our vision of existence. Different potentialities are embodied, placed, related in this field of time and space, each with its powers and possibilities fronting other powers and possibilities, and as a result, the successions of time become in their appearance to the mind a working out of things by shock and struggle and not a spontaneous succession. In reality, there is a spontaneous working out of things from within, and the external shock and struggle are only the superficial aspect of this elaboration. because the inner and inherent law of the one and whole, which is necessarily a harmony, oh, what a great line. The inner and inherent law of the one and whole, which is necessarily a harmony, governs the outer and processive laws of the parts or forms which appear to be in collision. And to the supramental vision, this greater and profounder truth of harmony is always present. That which is an apparent discord to the mind because it considers each thing separately in itself, is an element of the general ever-present and ever-developing harmony to the supermind because it views all things in a multiple unity. Besides, the mind sees only a given time and space and views many possibilities pell-mell as all more or less realizable in that time and space. The divine supermind sees the whole extension of time and space and can embrace all the mind's possibilities, and very many more not visible to the mind, but without any error, groping or confusion, because it perceives each potentiality in its proper force, essential necessity, right relation to the others and the time, place and circumstance, both of its gradual and its ultimate realization. To see things steadily and see them whole is not possible to the mind, but it is the very nature of the transcendent supermind. This supermind in its conscious vision not only contains all the forms of itself which its conscious force creates, but it pervades them as an indwelling presence and a self-revealing light. It is present even though concealed in every form and force of the universe. It is that which determines sovereignly and spontaneously form, force and functioning. It limits the variations it compels. It gathers, disperses, modifies the energy which it uses. And all this is done in accordance with the first laws that its self-knowledge has fixed, which its self-knowledge has fixed in the very birth of the form, at the very starting point of the force. Now, for the first laws, he has given a footnote. He's saying it's a Vedic expression. The gods act according to the first laws, original and therefore supreme, which are the laws of the truth of things. It is seated within everything as the Lord in the heart of all existence. It is seated in everything as the Lord. In what? In the heart of all existences. He who turns them as on an engine. He who turns them as on an engine by the power of his Maya. It's written in Gita 18th verse 61. It is within them and embraces them as the divine seer who variously disposed and ordained subjects, each rightly according to the thing that it is from years sempiternal. It's in the Isha Upanishad verse 8. Each thing in nature, therefore, whether animate or inanimate, mentally self-conscious or not self-conscious, is governed in its being and in its operations by an indwelling vision and power, to us subconscient or inconscient because we are not conscious of it, but not inconscient to itself, rather profoundly and universally conscient. Therefore, each thing seems to do the works of intelligence, even without possessing intelligence, because it obeys, whether subconsciously as in the plant and animal or half-consciously as in man, the real idea of the divine supermind within it. But it is not a mental intelligence that informs and governs all things. It is a self-aware truth of being in which self-knowledge is inseparable from self-existence. It is this truth consciousness which has not to think out things, but works them out with knowledge according to the impeccable self-vision and the inevitable force of a soul and self-fulfilling existence. This is a very important sentence. It is this truth consciousness which has not to think out things but works them out with knowledge according to the impeccable self-vision and the inevitable force of a soul, S-O-L-E, soul and self-fulfilling existence. Mental intelligence thinks out because it is merely a reflecting force of consciousness which does not know but seeks to know. It follows in time, step by step, the working of a knowledge higher than itself, a knowledge that exists always, one and whole, that holds time in its grasp, that sees past, present and future in a single regard. This then is the first operative principle of the divine supermind. It is a cosmic vision which is all-comprehensive, all-pervading, all-inhabiting. Because it comprehends all things in being and static self-awareness, subjective, timeless, spaceless. Therefore, it comprehends all things in dynamic knowledge and governs their objective self-embodiment in space and time. In this consciousness, the knower, knowledge, and the known are not different entities, but fundamentally one. Our mentality makes a distinction between these three because without distinctions it cannot proceed. Losing its proper means and fundamental laws of action, it becomes motionless and inactive. Therefore, even when I regard myself mentally, I have still to make this distinction. I am, as the knower, what I observe in myself. I regard as the object of my knowledge myself, yet not myself. Knowledge is an operation by which I link the knower to the known. But the artificiality, the purely practical and utilitarian character of this operation is evident. It is evident that it does not represent the fundamental truth of things. In reality, I, the knower, am the consciousness which knows. I, the knower, am the consciousness which knows. The knowledge is that consciousness, myself operating. The known is also myself, a form or movement of the same consciousness. The three are clearly one existence, one movement, indivisible though seeming to be divided, not distributed between its forms, although appearing to distribute itself and to stand separate in each. But this is a knowledge which the mind can arrive at, can reason out, can feel, but cannot readily make the practical basis of its knowledge operations. And with regard to objects external to the form of consciousness which I call myself, the difficulty becomes almost insuperable. Even to feel unity, there is an abnormal effort, and to retain it, to act upon it continually, would be a new and foreign action not properly belonging to the mind. Mind can at most hold it as an understood truth, so as to correct and modify by it its own normal activities, which are still based upon division. Somewhat as we know intellectually that the earth moves around the sun and are able to correct by it, but not abolish the artificial and physically practical arrangement by which the senses persist in regarding the sun as in motion around the earth. But the supermind possesses and acts always, fundamentally, on this truth of unity which to the mind is only a secondary or acquired possession and not the very grain of its seeing. Supermind sees the universe and its contents as itself in a single indivisible act of knowledge, an act which is its life, which is the very movement of its self-existence. Therefore, this comprehensive divine consciousness in its aspect of will does not so much guide or govern the development of cosmic life as consummate in itself by an act of power which is inseparable from the act of knowledge and from the movement of self-existence, is indeed one and the same act. Because we have seen that universal force and universal consciousness are one. Cosmic force is the operation of cosmic consciousness. So also, divine knowledge and divine will are one. They are the same fundamental movement or act of existence. This indivisibility of the comprehensive supermind, which contains all multiplicity without derogating from its own unity, is a truth upon which we have always to insist if we are to understand the cosmos and get rid of the initial error of our analytic mentality. A tree evolves out of the seed in which it is already contained. The seed out of the tree, a fixed law. A tree evolves out of the seed in which it is already contained, that is, the seed out of the tree. A fixed law, an invariable process, reigns in the permanence of the form of manifestation, which we call a tree. The mind regards this phenomenon, this birth, life, and reproduction of a tree, as a thing in itself, and on that basis classes and explains it. It explains the tree by the seed by the tree. It declares a law of nature, but it has explained nothing. It has only analyzed and recorded the process of a mystery. This is very important. It has explained nothing, it has only analyzed and recorded the process of a mystery. Supposing even that it comes to perceive a secret conscious force as the soul, the real being of this form and the rest as merely a settled operation and manifestation of that force, still it tends to regard the form as a separate existence with its separate law of nature and process of development. In the animal and in man, with his conscious mentality, this separative tendency of the mind induces it to regard itself also as a separate existence, the conscious subject, and other forms as separate objects of its mentality. This useful arrangement, necessary to life and the first basis of all its practice, is accepted by the mind as an actual fact, and thence proceeds all the error of the ego. But the supermind works otherwise. The tree and its process would not be what they are, could not indeed exist if it were a separate existence. Forms are what they are by the force of the cosmic existence. They develop as they do as a result of their relation to it and to all its other manifestations. The separate laws of their nature is only an application of the universal law and truth of all nature. Their particular development is determined by their place in the general development. The tree does not explain the seed, nor the seed the tree. Cosmos explains both, and God explains cosmos. The supermind, pervading and inhabiting at once the seed and the tree and all objects, lives in this greater knowledge which is indivisible and one, though with a modified and not an absolute indivisibility and unity. In this comprehensive knowledge there is no independent center of existence, no individual separated ego, such as we see in ourselves. The whole of existence is to its self-awareness an equable extension, one in oneness, one in multiplicity, one in all conditions and everywhere. Here the all and the one are the same existence. The individual being does not and cannot lose the consciousness of its identity with all beings and with the one being, because that identity is inherent in supramental cognition, a part of the supramental self-evidence. In that spacious equality of oneness, the being is not divided and distributed, equably self-extended, pervading its extension as one, inhabiting as one the multiplicity of forms. It is everywhere at once the single and equal Brahman. Because this extension of the being in time and space and this pervasion and indwelling is in intimate relation with the absolute unity from which it has proceeded, with that absolute indivisible in which there is no center or circumference, but only the timeless and spaceless one. That high concentration of unity in the unextended Brahman must necessarily translate itself in the extension by this equal pervasive concentration, this indivisible comprehension of all things, this universal and undistributed immanence, this unity which no play of multiplicity can abrogate or diminish. Brahman is in all things are in Brahman, all things are Brahman, is the triple formula of comprehensive supermind, a single truth of self-manifestation in three aspects which it holds together and inseparably in its self-view as the fundamental knowledge from which it proceeds to the play of the cosmos. But what then is the origin of mentality and the organization of this lower consciousness in the triple terms of mind, life and matter, which is our view of the universe, mind, life and matter? Because since all things that exist must proceed from the action of the all-efficient supermind, from its operation in the three original terms of existence, conscious force and bliss, there must be some faculty of the creative truth consciousness which so operates as to cast them into these new terms, into this inferior trio of mentality, vitality and physical substance. This faculty we find in a secondary power of the creative knowledge, its power of a projecting, confronting and apprehending consciousness in which knowledge centralizes itself and stands back from its works to observe them. And when we speak of centralization, we mean, as distinguished from the equable concentration of consciousness of which we have hitherto spoken, an unequal concentration in which there is the beginning of self-division or of its phenomenal appearance. First of all, the knower holds himself concentrated in knowledge as subject and regards the knower holds himself concentrated in knowledge as subject and regards his force of consciousness as if continually proceeding from him into the form of himself, continually working in it, continually drawing back into himself, continually issuing forth again. From this single act of self-modification proceed all the practical distinctions upon which the relative view and the relative action of the universe is based. A practical distinction has been created between the knower, knowledge, and the known, between the Lord, his force, and the children and works of the force, between the enjoyer, the enjoyment, and the enjoyed, between the self, Maya, and the becomings of the self. Secondly, the conscious soul concentrated in knowledge, this Purusha, observing and governing the force that has gone forth from him, his Shakti or Prakriti, repeats himself in every form of himself. He accompanies, as it were, his force of consciousness into its works and reproduces there the act of self-division from which this apprehending consciousness is born. In each form, this soul dwells with his nature and observes himself in other forms from that artificial and practical center of consciousness. In all it is the same soul, the same divine being. The multiplication of centers is only a practical act of consciousness intended to institute a play of difference, of mutuality, mutual knowledge, mutual shock of force, mutual enjoyment, a difference based upon essential unity, a unity realized on a practical basis of difference. We can speak of this new status of the all-pervading supermind as a further departure from the Unitarian truth of things and from the indivisible consciousness which constitutes inalienably the unity essential to the existence of the cosmos. We can see that pursued a little farther, it may become truly avidya, the great ignorance which starts from multiplicity as the fundamental reality, and in order to travel back to real unity, has to commence with the false unity of the ego. We can see also that once the individual center is accepted as the determining standpoint, as the knower, mental sensation, mental intelligence, mental action of will, and all their consequences cannot fail to come into being. But also we have to see that so long as the soul acts in the supermind, ignorance has not yet begun. The field of knowledge and action is still the truth consciousness. The basis is still the unity. Because the self still regards itself as one in all and all things as becomings in itself and of itself. The Lord still knows his force as himself in act, and every being as himself in soul and himself in form. It is still his own being that the enjoyer enjoys, even though in a multiplicity. The one real change has been an unequal concentration of consciousness and a multiple distribution of force. There is a practical distinction in consciousness, but there is no essential difference of consciousness or true division in its vision of itself. The true consciousness has arrived at a position which prepares our mentality, but is not yet that of our mentality. And it is this that we must study in order to seize mind at its origin, at the point where it makes its great lapse from the high and vast wideness of the truth consciousness into the division and ignorance. Fortunately, this apprehending truth consciousness is much more facile to our grasp by its nearness to us, by its foreshadowing of our mental operations than the remoter realization that we have hitherto been struggling to express in our inadequate language of the intellect. Now there's a footnote regarding this line called, "Fortunately this apprehending truth consciousness," and he's making the note that it's also called prajnana. And then he says, the barrier that has to be crossed is less formidable.